فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات والقانتين والقانتات والصادقين والصادقات والصابرين والصابرات والخاشعين والخاشعات والمتصدقين والمتصدقات والصائمين والصائمات والحافظين فروجهم والحافظات والذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات أعد الله لهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما صدق الله العظيم وبلغنا رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Surah Ahzab, the background of this 35th ayah as recorded by Mufassirin is that in pretty much all the places in the Quran the commandments have been given addressing the men, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, the people who have brought faith, and women, their cover has been maintained and their honor has been maintained. In fact, if you look at it, the ulama have written that in the whole Quran there is not the name of any woman except Sayyidah Maryam alayhi salam, and her name is given to because there was no father of her Sayyidina Isa alayhi salatu wassalam, so his mother's name was mentioned. Apart from that, general style of the Quran is that men are addressed and women are considered included. So some Sahabiyat came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said that, Ya Rasulullah, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never addresses us, never addresses women. Is there no goodness in us? And we fear that Allah would absolve all our good deeds even on the day of judgment. Allah does not even like to mention us. So in a few places Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has particularly mentioned the Nisa as well. This ayah is one of the examples where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has clarified that Allah in terms of good deeds considers men and women equal. Innal muslimina wal muslimat, surely the believing, the Muslim men and the Muslim women. Wal mu'minina wal mu'minat, believing men, believing women. Wal qanitina wal qanitat, devout men and devout women, those who dedicate themselves and exert in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Was sadiqina was sadiqat, truthful men and truthful women. Was sabirina was sabirat, men who are patient and women who are patient. Wal khashi'ina wal khashi'at, humble men and humble women. Wal mutasaddiqina wal mutasaddiqat, and the men who give sadaqah and the women who give sadaqah, charity. Was sa'imina was sa'imat, and the men who fast and the women who fast. Wal hafidhina furujahum wal hafidhat, and the men who guard their private parts against evil acts and the women. وَالذَّاكِرِينَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا وَالذَّاكِرَاتِ, and the men who remember Allah much and the women who remember Allah. أَعَدَّ اللَّهُ لَهُمْ مَغْفِرَةً وَأَجْرًا عَظِيمًا, Allah has promised them, all of them, Allah has prepared for them forgiveness and a great reward. So there is no difference, Allah rewards equally. Another thing that should be mentioned is that every ibadat mentioned in here has a limit. The fear of Allah, submission to Allah, giving charity, fasting, all of these things have a limit. But for dhikr, for remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah has said, وَالذَّاكِرِينَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا, Allah has not placed a limit over how much dhikr or how much remembrance should be. In fact, the remembrance of Allah should be, mindfulness of Allah should be 24/7. There is no limit to it, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has considered it the most virtuous, the most rewardful act. The next part, 2 or 3 ayat of the surah, refer to a particular instance. We'll start it tonight inshallah. The first part of it is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had one Sahabi, Hazrat Zayd radiallahu an, Ibn Haritha. He was a slave and bought by the Prophet ﷺ and then freed and made a son. So the Makkans used to call him Zayd ibn Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that was considered a great honor for him. He was a Muslim and he considered it a great honor for himself that I am called the son of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But as we read in the beginning of this surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nullified this and said that ud'uhum li abaihim, call them by the names of their real fathers. So it was prohibited to call anybody, and Zayd ibn Muhammad radiallahu anh he was now called Zayd ibn Haritha. The command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was enacted and Sahaba stopped calling him Zayd ibn Muhammad, but it was a thing that he felt, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compensated for this by mentioning his name in the Quran. And there is no one else among the Sahaba, even Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu or others, whose name has been mentioned or whose mention has been made with their name in the Quran, but Zayd radiallahu anhu, in the next ayah that we are going to read inshallah next week, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned him by his name. Another honor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him, and this person was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned that we did mercy to him and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did mercy to him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him faith and made him a believer. Then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was trained right under the direct company of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the direct service of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and because of this he was well respected among the highest Sahaba as well. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam encouraged the family of his paternal aunt, the daughter of his paternal aunt, Hazrat Zainab bint Jahash radiallahu anha, upon the recommendation of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, their nikah was enacted. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam married him into his own family. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam recommended to the family of Zainab radiallahu anha, because Hazrat Zaid had this attached with his name that he used to be a slave and he's a freed slave, the family of the girl showed some hesitation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the reason it was based on was that there's a concept of kuf in Islam, which is a valid concept and something that is recommended, which is that a marrying girl and a marrying boy or a man should be from the same social respect and status. And the reason is that if they come from vastly different backgrounds, then the purpose of nikah will be obstructed. If they are not attracted to each other because of this, then the purpose of nikah will be obstructed. So therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has kept a social consideration for Muslims. But it is not allowed to look down upon anyone because of their profession or because of their social status. But the family of Zainab radiallahu anha, her brother, and if I remember correct, her mother was alive, and they had some hesitation. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had not given them a specific clear command, he had only encouraged and given his counsel. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَنْ يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ وَمَنْ يَعْصِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ فَقَدْ ضَلَّ ضَلَالًا مُبِينًا. It is not open for a believing man or a believing woman, once Allah and His Messenger have decided a thing, that they should have a choice about their matter, and whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he indeed gets off the track, falling into an open error. So listening to this, they let go of their hesitation, which was that the kuf does not match, and Hazrat Zaid and Hazrat Zainab ibn Jahash, Hazrat Zaid ibn Haritha and Hazrat Zainab ibn Jahash radiyallahu anhum, they were entered into nikah. Inshallah we'll continue reading about this nikah and what happened in next week inshallah. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين آمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.